The first bale hit the steel roll-off hard enough to shake loose a brown cloud of chaff. By 9 that morning, the town crew had already thrown away 143. Ethan Mercer, 44, stood outside the chain-link gate in a faded canvas coat, watching a loader carry another square bale from the leaking north bay of the old municipal feed warehouse. His father had lost 80 acres to debt when Ethan was 19, and ever since he had measured waste by what it might cost to replace. Ruined for feed wasn't ruined for soil, Ethan said. Leah Mercer looked at him instead of the hay. She was 41, narrow-shouldered, with blonde hair twisted under a work cap and a pencil tucked above one ear. 3 bad harvests had trained her to write down every dollar before spending it. Across the yard, Dennis Kroll shut off the loader. He was 58, broad through the chest, with the missing tip of his right index finger folded against a clipboard. A snowblower had taken it 20 years earlier, leaving him suspicious of any job that looked simpler than it was. "You planning to feed that to something?" Dennis asked. "No," Ethan said. "Good. Town won't release it as livestock feed. Roof leaked all winter. Some molded, some just got wet, and nobody wants the liability." Behind him, the warehouse door stood open on row after row of stained square bales stacked nearly to the rafters. 8,000, according to the inventory sheet beneath Dennis's hand. The town had called livestock operators, brokers, and a disposal contractor. Nobody wanted the lot. Leah stepped closer. The air smelled of wet grass, rust, diesel exhaust, and hay beginning to sour. "How much are you paying to dump it?" she asked. Dennis gave a tired laugh. "Enough that I'd rather not." Ethan rubbed his thumb over a split in his glove. Their apple orchard sat 11 miles away on sandy ground that dried faster each July. He was not looking at feed. It wasn't optimism, it was arithmetic. Leah knew that look. "How many can we take?" Ethan kept his eyes on the warehouse. "All of them." Dennis stopped smiling. Neither Mercer owned enough truck, trailer, time, or cash to move 8,000 bales before the city wanted the yard cleared. 6 months later, those same bales would lie in measured bands beneath rows of apple trees, holding something the Mercers had been paying dearly to lose every summer. First, they had to stop the loader. Before we go any farther, subscribe if you like patient farm stories where the numbers matter, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ethan and Leah were about to do made sense only after you understood how little room they had left for another bad decision, and how quickly their 83-day clock was already running. In the spring of 2017, Ethan and Leah Mercer farmed 21 acres in Van Buren County, Michigan, where lake winds could keep an orchard alive one week and strip blossoms from it the next. Their place sat outside the fictional town of Renford, beyond a 2-lane road lined with drainage ditches, volunteer maples, and mailbox posts bleached gray by salt. 7 acres carried 612 apple trees, a mixed planting that Ethan's father had started before debt took most of the family ground. The oldest trunks leaned slightly east from years of prevailing wind, and the youngest rows still showed white guards around their bases where rabbits had worked the bark the winter before. The rest of the property was harder to love. Along the south edge, 4 acres of pale, sandy ground had become known as the Sand Rose, even though only part of it still held trees. Water disappeared there almost as quickly as they could apply it. By late July, the surface often powdered beneath a boot, and grass between the rows turned the color of old rope, while better ground farther north stayed green another week. 100 feet from those rows stood an abandoned cider shed with a sagging roof, 1 boarded window, and a concrete floor cracked wide enough for lamb's quarter to grow through it. Ethan stored broken bins there because repairing the building had never climbed high enough on the list. The list was long. That March, the well pump failed without warning. Replacing it cost money they had set aside for spray, fuel, and the first half of their property tax. Leah covered the difference by postponing repairs to the packing room cooler and cutting their household grocery budget to the point where she could tell, without checking, how many cans of coffee remained in the pantry. Their lender did not care how the pump had failed. On the 15th of June, a payment of $18,600 would come due. On the morning Ethan asked for the hay, they had exactly 83 days left. Leah had written the number on the inside cover of the farm ledger in blue ink. 83. Every morning after that, she drew one line through it and wrote the next number below. Ethan hated looking at the page. He had been 19 when his father signed away 80 acres after 2 bad seasons and 1 loan renewal too many. And he remembered the sound of the kitchen chair scraping backward when the papers were done. He had spent 25 years believing that enough work could keep that sound from returning. It could not by itself. Leah understood that better than he did. The orchard still had value, but value that was hanging on trees could not make a June payment in March. Their checking account held $212 after the pump bill cleared. The farm truck needed front tires before harvest. The south rows needed more water every year, and 612 trees did not stop needing attention because a family had run short of cash. So when Ethan looked through a municipal fence at 8,000 rejected hay bales, he was not seeing free material. He was seeing one expense that might disappear. What neither of them knew yet was whether taking those bales would save money or simply create a larger problem they could no longer afford. Dennis Kroll did not stop the loader because Ethan asked him to. He stopped it because Leah Mercer asked for the paperwork. "If we move it, I want something that says it's ours," she said. Dennis looked from Leah to Ethan, then toward the open warehouse. "You really mean all of it?" "All of it," Ethan said. Leah did not move. "On paper." Dennis exhaled through his nose, walked back to the Public Works office and returned with a 1-page transfer form clipped to a metal board. He wrote the date, identified the material as the hay stored in the North Bay, and added that the town transferred the property as is at the moment the Mercers removed it from the yard. Leah read every line before signing beneath Ethan's name. Dennis signed last. Ethan glanced at the page. "You planning to frame that?" "I'm planning to keep it." Leah folded the copy twice and slid it into the inside pocket of the farm ledger. The first trailer they borrowed belonged to Jerome Parks, 63, a thick-wristed neighbor with a permanent grease line beneath his left thumbnail. Jerome had once lent a hay wagon to a cousin who returned it with a bent axle and no apology, and since then he treated borrowed equipment like a test of character. He stood beside the trailer while Ethan checked the tires. 8,000 wet bales, Jerome said. "That your new retirement plan?" Ethan tightened the hitch. "Temporary storage plan." Jerome snorted. "Looks permanent from here." The second trailer came from Carla Benton, 56, a small-framed fruit grower with silver hair cut close around her ears. A hailstorm had wiped out most of one peach crop 12 years earlier, and since then she distrusted any idea that depended on weather behaving politely. "You stack that stuff around apple trunks," Carla said, "and you'd better know what's living under it by August." Leah wrote that down. Over 6 days, they made 56 loads. The trip from the municipal yard to Mercer Orchard took 11 miles each way. Ethan drove the farm truck until his shoulders stiffened from checking mirrors. Leah rode the second rig whenever Carla could spare it, counting bales at the yard and again at the farm. They loaded by hand where the municipal forklift could not reach, carrying square bales that felt heavier at one end where roof water had soaked them. Wet twine cut into gloves. Loose chaff stuck to sweat at the neck. By the third day, the old cider shed was full. By the fourth, they had built long stacks on pallets behind it and covered the tops with tarps, leaving the sides open because Leah did not trust trapping more moisture inside. On the fifth afternoon, a bale split while Ethan was lifting it from the trailer. Dark, matted hay spilled across the gravel. Jerome, passing on his tractor, slowed to look. "That one feeding your dirt, too?" Ethan bent, gathered the loose hay with both arms, and carried it to the stack. "Maybe." On the sixth evening, the last load came through the orchard gate under a sky the color of dull tin. Leah counted the final row twice, then wrote the total in the ledger. 8,000 bales removed from the town yard. They had managed to save everyone from the landfill. They still had no idea how many were actually worth keeping. Earl Whitmore arrived the next morning in a dented green pickup with a pruning saw behind the seat. and no interest in congratulating anybody. He was 79, tall once but bent slightly through the shoulders now, with a white mustache, a canvas cap polished dark at the brim, and 2 fingers on his right hand that no longer closed all the way. Arthritis had ended his commercial orchard work 6 years earlier. He had sold his trees when he could no longer climb a ladder safely, then watched younger growers solve problems with equipment and chemicals that had once been solved by walking rows, turning soil with a boot, and paying attention to what stayed damp after noon. Ethan met him beside the cider shed. "I heard you brought home the town dump," Earl said. 8,000 bales. That wasn't praise. Earl pulled one from the nearest stack, cut the twine with a pocket knife, and opened it across a pallet. He did not ask whether it looked bad. He asked where it had been in the warehouse. Leah brought out the municipal inventory sheet. They had recorded loads by section as the bales came out, and Earl made her separate the stacks into rough groups before he touched another one. Hay from the outer wall had taken roof water directly. Hay from the center had stayed drier. The lowest courses had spent months carrying the weight of everything above them. "You don't have one pile," Earl said. "You've got several kinds of trouble mixed together." For the next 2 days he made them sort. A bale that held its shape, opened without heat, and separated into loose stems went to the orchard stack. A bale that had a damp outer face but a sound, separable center went there too, marked for early use. But when the strings came off and the whole bale collapsed into dense, dark mats that could not be spread evenly, Earl sent it somewhere else. "Compost row," he said. Ethan frowned. "That still looks usable. Then spread that brick around a tree and tell me which root gets the same treatment as the next one." Ethan said nothing. Earl was not trying to save hay. He was trying to make the material predictable. They built a separate windrow beyond the equipment lane for the worst bales, where the material could be broken apart and managed as compost instead of being mistaken for uniform mulch. Leah marked every diversion in the ledger. By sunset on the first sorting day, 147 bales had gone to that row. The second day added 221 more. 368 bales were too collapsed and uneven for the system Earl was willing to build beneath the trees. 8,000 minus 368 left 7,632. Leah boxed the number in blue ink. 7,632 bales remained for the orchard. Ethan looked toward the sand rows where pale ground showed between trunks and a dry southwest wind lifted dust along the lane. "You used hay like this before?" he asked. Earl rested both hands on the head of his walking stick. "Not like this much at once." That was the part Ethan had not expected. Earl had learned orchard floor management when mowing, cultivation, handwork, manure, and whatever organic material a farm could spare were ordinary tools. Over the years, herbicide strips, irrigation systems, and purchased inputs had made some of those old habits less necessary on larger operations. Earl had not forgotten them. He had simply stopped having anyone ask. He walked to the nearest apple tree and scraped back the grass with the edge of his boot. Then he pointed at the trunk, the bare soil beneath it, and the nearest stack of hay. "Show me where you were planning to put the first bale," he said. Earl Whitmore made Ethan cut the first bale open 20 feet from the tree. "Not against the trunk," Earl said. "You learn what it does before you make the tree live with it." They worked in the sand rows where the grass between trees had already begun to fade at the tips. Leah Mercer carried the ledger, a folding ruler, and 6 narrow wooden stakes cut from scrap lattice. Ethan Mercer brought a hay knife, a garden fork, and the impatience of a man who could see 7,632 bales waiting behind the cider shed. Earl ignored the pile. He opened one bale, shook the flakes apart, and spread the hay loosely over the soil in a band beneath the outer half of the canopy. Then he pushed one of Leah's stakes through the layer and marked 3 inches with a pencil. "That's your first rule," Earl said. "Measure it after you fluff it. A bale lying whole is not mulch. It's a wet mattress." He made them leave a clear ring around the trunk, wide enough that no hay touched bark. The point was not decoration. Bark stayed healthier when it could dry, and loose mulch worked best as a blanket over soil, not as a collar packed against wood. A thick collar could hold moisture where Ethan did not want it, hide chewing damage, and make inspection harder. The second rule was about water. Mulch did not create water. It changed how quickly water left the soil. Bare ground heated in direct sun, and moisture near the surface disappeared faster through evaporation. A loose organic layer shaded the soil and reduced that direct loss. It also reduced weed growth where the layer was deep enough, which meant fewer plants competing with the apple roots for water. But Earl would not let Ethan judge moisture by touching the hay itself. The top could feel dry while the soil below still held water, or the hay could feel damp after a light rain that never reached deeply enough. So Earl pushed a narrow soil probe through the mulch and into the root zone, pulled it out, and crumbled the soil between his fingers. "Check the dirt," Earl said. "The tree drinks from dirt." Leah wrote that sentence in the margin. The third rule was consistency. They did not spread by eye alone. Every 10th tree received a marked stake. Leah recorded row number, mulch depth, irrigation time, soil feel, and whether the trunk ring was still clear. Ethan hated the extra minutes at first until Earl showed him 2 neighboring trees where the same number of forkfuls had produced different depths because one pile had settled tighter. By the end of the first afternoon, they had covered only 37 trees. Ethan looked toward the stacks. "At this rate, winter gets here first." "Then quit wasting time being wrong," Earl said. The next morning, they changed the work. Ethan cut twine and opened bales ahead of the row. Leah broke the flakes apart with a fork and spread them to the marked depth. Earl walked behind them, lifting random sections with his stick, checking for bare soil, packed mats, and hay-touching bark. When he found a mistake, he did not fix it himself, he pointed. Ethan or Leah fixed it. By the 4th day, the rhythm had become mechanical. Cut, loosen, carry, spread, measure, clear the trunk, record the row. They learned how much material the thin ground accepted without creating thick ridges, and they stopped treating every bale as if it had to disappear immediately. The routine changed the rest of the farm. Pruning repairs moved to evenings. Equipment work happened after dark under the shed light. Leah checked moisture before breakfast and again late in the afternoon, while Ethan hauled opened bales to the next section before the sun heated the lane. The stacks behind the cider shed finally began to shrink. Earl came less often, but when he did, he found fewer places to point at. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Ethan faster. And after 3 days of seeing cooler soil under the hay and cleaner ground around the trees, he decided that if 3 inches helped, more might help faster. For 3 days, Ethan Mercer thought he had improved Earl Whitmore's system. The thicker bands looked better to him. Where 3 inches of loose hay had left bits of dark soil visible after settling, Ethan added more until the sand rows looked completely covered. Around the weakest young trees, he nearly doubled the depth. He still kept most of the hay away from the trunks, but he stopped measuring every section because the extra material felt like insurance. Leah noticed the difference on the second afternoon. "That's deeper than Earl marked. It settles." "How much?" Ethan pressed one hand into the hay. "Enough to do more good." For 3 days, nothing argued with him. The ground beneath the cover stayed cooler to the touch. Weeds disappeared. The upper hay remained damp longer after irrigation. Ethan began shortening the water run in those rows because he believed the thicker mulch was doing more of the work. On the 4th afternoon, Leah found the first curled leaves. They were on a young tree near the east end of row 9. By the time she walked the next 2 rows, she had counted 22 trees with leaves folding inward at the edges, the dull green surface losing its shine. Ethan pulled hay back from the nearest trunk. "It's wet." Leah knelt and pushed the soil probe down. The first few inches were not. She called Earl. He arrived 40 minutes later, stepped over the irrigation line, and did not look at Ethan until he had checked 6 trees himself. Earl lifted the hay, pushed the probe through the soil, and broke a small core apart between his fingers. "You watered the cover," he said. "I ran the same line." "No, you ran it less." Ethan looked at Leah. She had the ledger open. Earl pointed at the thick mat beside his boot. Organic mulch could slow evaporation after water reached the soil, he explained, but it could not replace the water that never got there. A deep, dense layer could catch part of a light application, spread it sideways, and stay damp enough to fool a hand laid on top. The only useful question was whether moisture had reached the soil where the active roots were. Then he showed Ethan the second problem. Several of the new piles had settled against the lower trunks overnight. Damp organic material pressed against bark made inspection harder and created exactly the protected space Earl had warned him not to build. "This isn't more of the same system," Earl said. "You changed the system." Ethan stared down the row. It had not been bad luck. The mistake had come directly from the thing Ethan trusted most about himself. He hated waste, hated bare ground, hated the thought that a bale he had worked to save might sit unused behind the shed. So he had tried to protect every tree with more material and less water, and he had stopped checking the one place that mattered. "I tried so hard not to waste it that I stopped looking underneath it," he said. Earl handed him the probe. "Then start looking." They spent the rest of that day undoing the excess. Leah marked every overbuilt section. Ethan pulled back the thickest mats, loosened what remained, reopened clear rings around the trunks, and restored the irrigation schedule until the soil itself, not the hay, showed moisture at the depth Earl wanted checked. By dark, they had removed the equivalent of 468 bales from the overbuilt sections and moved that material beside the earlier compost row. 7,632 minus 468 left 7,164. Leah boxed the new number, 7,164. The 22 stressed trees were still standing. Whether Ethan had corrected the mistake soon enough would not be clear until the leaves answered. The next morning, Ethan Mercer did not touch the stacks until Leah Mercer finished walking every damaged row. She carried the ledger in one hand and the soil probe in the other. At each of the 22 stressed trees, she pulled the hay back, checked the soil beneath it, looked at the bark around the base, and marked the condition of the leaves. Ethan followed with a fork and a measuring stick. Earl Whitmore stood at the end of row 9 and watched them work without giving instructions. "What are you waiting for?" Ethan asked. "To see if you remember yesterday." Ethan looked down at the first tree. He loosened the remaining hay instead of packing it flat. He spread it back to the measured depth. He cleared the trunk until air and light could reach the bark. Then he pushed the probe through the mulch and into the soil before deciding whether the irrigation line needed to run. Earl nodded once. That became the rebuild. Not more hay. Not less hay by instinct. A repeatable order. First, they marked the acceptable depth on every inspection stake so neither of them could argue with memory. Second, they broke apart compressed flakes before spreading them, because a loose layer behaved differently from a slab still holding the shape of a bale. Third, they kept the mulch pulled back from each trunk and checked that ring every morning, especially after wind or rain shifted loose material. Fourth, they judged irrigation by the soil under the mulch, not by the color or dampness of the hay on top. And fifth, Leah wrote down every correction by row number so a mistake could be found again instead of rediscovered. The work slowed them at first. Ethan wanted to recover the time he had lost, but Earl stopped him from changing 3 things at once. If the soil was dry, they restored water. If the layer was too deep, they thinned it. If hay had touched bark, they moved it. One cause, one correction, then another check. "You don't fix a system by making it harder to read," Earl said. By the third day, the corrected rows looked less impressive from the road. The hay bands were thinner and uneven at the edges. More ground showed around the trunks. Ethan disliked that until Leah reminded him that the trees did not care what Jerome Parks thought from a tractor seat. The 22 stressed trees did not recover all at once. Some leaves stayed curled. Several dropped early. On 3 trees, the newest shoots remained soft and dull even after the soil moisture improved. Leah marked those 3 with red cloth so they would not confuse hope with evidence. Earl approved of the cloth. "Now you're looking at what happened, not what you want to happen." He came every morning for 4 days. On the 5th, he did not come until noon. On the 6th, he arrived after Ethan and Leah had already finished the moisture checks, cleared 2 shifted trunk rings, and adjusted irrigation in one section without calling him. Ethan handed him the ledger. Earl read the notes slowly. "You missed row 14 yesterday." Leah pointed to a second page. "Moved it here because the line leaked." Earl grunted. The next morning his truck never appeared. Ethan called him after breakfast. "You sick?" "No." "You coming out?" "No." Ethan waited. Earl finally said, "If this only works when I'm standing there, then I didn't teach you anything." The line went quiet. Outside, the sand rows were already warming under a clear sky. Leah was halfway down row 11 with the probe, and Ethan could see her kneel, lift the mulch, check the soil, and write something before moving to the next tree. 7,164 bales remained in the working system, and that number had not changed. What had changed was who was responsible for knowing whether the system still worked. 3 mornings later, before sunrise, Leah saw something on one of the red-marked trees that made her stop walking. At 4:38 in the morning, Leah Mercer was halfway down row 11 when the beam of her flashlight caught a color she had not seen there 3 days earlier. She stopped. The orchard was almost silent. A light breeze moved through the upper leaves, and somewhere near the irrigation manifold, one emitter released a slow, regular drip. Leah stood without moving for several seconds, listening to make sure the sound was only water and not a line leaking under pressure. Then she crouched beside the tree marked with red cloth. At the end of one weak shoot, just beyond the curled leaves, a new tip had pushed forward. It was small, soft, and a brighter green than the older growth around it. Leah touched the branch below it with one finger, not the tip itself, and held the flashlight closer. Fresh growth. She did not call Ethan yet. Instead, she checked the soil. The hay on top felt cool and slightly damp from the night air, but Leah ignored it. She lifted the loose layer, pushed the probe into the root zone, withdrew it, and pressed the soil between her fingers. It held together lightly before breaking apart. That was the rule Earl had made them learn the hard way. Do not water the hay. Do not water the appearance of the tree. Check the soil first. Leah wanted to open the irrigation valve anyway. The new chute looked fragile enough that another hour without water felt careless. But the soil beneath it still held moisture, and adding water simply because she was frightened of losing the tree would have repeated the same mistake in a different form. So she left the valve closed. Ethan found her 20 minutes later in row 12. "You been out here long?" "Long enough." She took him back to the red cloth. He leaned close, saw the new green tip, and smiled before he could stop himself. "One?" "So far." They walked every one of the 22 stressed trees before breakfast. Leah checked soil first. Ethan checked the newest shoots. They found fresh extension growth on 7 trees that morning, then 12 by the following evening. By the third morning, 19 of the 22 showed some new growth or firmer leaves. 3 did not. Their leaves stayed dull, and the newest tissue never hardened the way the others did. Leah circled those 3 in the ledger. 19 answering, Ethan said. 3 not yet. "You think they're gone?" Leah looked at the page. "I think we don't know." That answer would have bothered Ethan a month earlier. Now he understood why Earl preferred it. They kept the same measured mulch depth, the same clear rings around the trunks, and the same moisture checks before irrigation. Ethan did not add hay to the 19 recovering trees. He did not strip hay from the 3 lagging ones. He stopped trying to make the orchard respond on his schedule. For 6 more days, the system held. 7,164 bales remained in productive use, and not one more was diverted. Then the weather forecast changed. A run of hotter days was moving toward Van Buren County, and the first afternoon was expected to push the orchard into conditions the Mercers had never tested, with hay beneath the trees. By the end of that week, the Mercer orchard no longer looked like a place where someone had dragged home the town's trash. It looked strange but deliberate. From the county road, the sand rows showed long bands of faded gold beneath the apple trees, each band broken by a clean circle around the trunk. The hay had settled from its first loose thickness and the surface had bleached pale under sun, while the lower stems stayed darker where they touched cooler soil. Behind the cider shed, the original stacks were nearly gone. Only a smaller reserve remained under tarps, squared off on pallets and lifted clear of the ground. Ethan Mercer stood at the end of row 14 with a fork across one shoulder and looked back toward the road. 7,164 bales had survived the sorting and the mistake. Some were already spread beneath the trees. Some waited in reserve for places where wind, settling, or later work would leave soil exposed. None of those 7,164 had been thrown away, burned, or hauled to a landfill. That number held for the rest of the story. Around noon, Jerome Parks came past on his tractor. For weeks he had slowed near the Mercer place without admitting why. This time he pulled onto the shoulder, shut the engine down, and climbed off. The sudden quiet made the orchard sound larger. Bees worked the white clover at the edge of the lane. A loose strip of hay scratched against one of Leah's wooden depth stakes. Somewhere beyond the rows, the old well pump clicked on. Jerome walked to the first tree and stopped before stepping onto the mulch. "So that's all town hay?" "Most of what you're looking at," Ethan said. Jerome bent, lifted a handful, and let the stems fall through his fingers. "Still smells like hay." "Top does." Ethan pushed the soil probe through the layer and brought up a small core. He broke it apart in his palm. Jerome touched the soil with 2 fingers. He did not laugh. The ground beneath the cover was cool enough that the difference registered immediately against the back of his hand. Farther out in the uncovered lane, the surface had already warmed and dried into loose grains. Jerome looked up the row again. "I reckon those bales are earning their keep." Ethan rested the probe against his boot. "They're not done yet." That afternoon, Leah finished counting the material by location. The working total remained 7,164, the same number she had boxed after Ethan's mistake. For the first time since the trucks began hauling from the municipal yard, the number no longer needed to fall. The town had discarded 8,000 bales because they could no longer serve the purpose they had been bought for. The Mercers had finally given the useful ones a different job. But the next test would not come from Dennis Kroll, Jerome Parks, or anyone standing beside the road. By the following afternoon, the temperature was climbing, the forecast had worsened, and the first real stretch of summer heat was settling over Van Buren County. The heat was not the first thing that went wrong. 2 mornings before the forecasted temperature spike, Leah Mercer found a narrow runway pressed through the hay beside a young tree in row 6. It was no wider than 2 fingers, hidden until she lifted the loose surface layer and saw a small tunnel leading toward the trunk. She called Ethan over. At the base of the tree, beneath the lowest edge of the guard, the bark showed fresh tooth marks. "Voles," Ethan said. Leah did not answer until she had checked the next tree. By noon, they had found signs around 11 young trees. 8 showed shallow chewing or nearby runways without damage circling the trunk. 3 were worse. On those, bark had been stripped across broad sections near the base, and Earl Whitmore, called back to inspect them, would not promise that all 3 would survive. "This is what cover does too," he said. "It protects what you want and sometimes what you don't." Ethan looked down the row of hay bands. For a moment, the old instinct returned. He wanted to pull everything out. Earl stopped him. "You had 11 trouble spots. Don't punish 600 trees because you found 11. They changed the routine instead. Around every young trunk, Ethan widened the clear inspection ring so mulch no longer gave rodents a concealed path directly to the bark. Leah walked the rows looking for pressed runways, droppings, fresh clipping, and disturbed soil before she checked moisture. Where grass had grown tall beside guards, they cut it back. On vulnerable young trees, they installed trunk protection carefully enough that it shielded the lower bark without trapping hay against it. The point was not to make the orchard impossible for a vole to enter. It was to remove the protected approach the Mercers had accidentally built. Organic cover could reduce evaporation and suppress weeds, but the same cover also changed habitat at ground level. A thick, undisturbed mat gave small rodents concealment from hawks and other predators. That meant the mulch could not become something Ethan spread once and forgot. It had to remain inspectable. Leah added one more column to the ledger. Vole sign. For 5 mornings, she marked every row either clear or active. The 8 lightly affected trees received wider clear zones and repeated checks. The 3 badly damaged trees received the same protection, but Leah marked them with yellow cloth so nobody would mistake survival for recovery until new growth proved it. No hay was discarded. Material pulled away from trunks was loosened and redistributed farther into the same row, where it could still cover soil without hiding bark. The working total remained 7,164 bales. The number held. On the 6th morning, Leah found no new chewing on the 8 lightly damaged trees. She did not celebrate. She wrote clear beside their row numbers and kept walking. By then, the air was already warm before breakfast. The weather radio had raised the forecast again, and the coming heat was no longer expected to last an afternoon. 6 days of it were moving across western Michigan. Before that heat reached the Mercer orchard, it would hit 2 neighboring farms first. The first afternoon of the heat wave belonged to Mason Reed. Mason was 51, broad-faced, with a white scar across his left forearm from a ladder fall that had kept him out of his own orchard for most of one harvest. Since then, he trusted visible damage more than forecasts. By 3 in the afternoon, the thermometer beside his packing shed read 101 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked 60 apple trees along his western block and counted 418 premature apples on the ground beneath them. The next morning, Carla Benton found her own number. 71 of 480 young trees showed obvious stress, their leaves cupping inward before noon while the grass between rows turned brittle at the tips. Carla had enough irrigation to keep water moving, but the dry air and hot ground were pulling moisture away faster than she liked. Neither farm had failed. Both were simply losing margin. The Mercer orchard took the same weather. By the 3rd day, the temperature reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heat held long enough that Ethan stopped trusting how green anything looked from the truck. He and Leah walked the orchard before breakfast, again at noon and once more near sunset. They lost fruit too. By the end of the 6-day stretch, Leah estimated 63 bushels had dropped early or lost enough quality that she would not count them toward the marketable crop. But the sand rows behaved differently from the uncovered lanes beside them. The difference was not that hay made heat harmless. It did not. The useful part happened at the soil surface. Sunlight striking bare ground transferred heat directly into the upper soil and sped evaporation from the exposed surface. A loose organic layer interrupted that exchange. The hay shaded the soil, reduced direct exposure to moving hot air, and slowed the loss of water that had already reached the root zone. Where weeds were suppressed beneath the mulch, fewer shallow-rooted plants were competing with the apple trees for the same moisture. That did not mean the Mercers could stop irrigating. Leah's probe kept proving why. On the hottest afternoon, the upper hay felt dry enough to crumble between her fingers. Underneath, soil in the mulched bands still held together lightly when squeezed. In an uncovered patch at the same depth beside the row, the sample broke apart faster and felt warmer in her palm. Ethan wanted a number for the difference. Earl Whitmore refused to invent one. "Your soil, your shade, your wind, your water," he said. "Measure what you got." So Leah did. She marked the time of each irrigation run, checked the same sampling points afterward, and wrote down how long the soil remained moist enough to hold a weak clump before breaking apart. The hay did not create water. It stretched the usefulness of water already applied. That was enough. The 19 trees that had recovered from Ethan's earlier mistake held through the heat. The 3 lagging trees remained uncertain, but they did not collapse during those 6 days. The 8 lightly vole-damaged trees showed no new chewing while Leah kept their trunk rings open. 7,164 bales remained in the working system. The number held. On the evening the heat finally broke, Ethan stood near the road while a west wind moved through leaves that had survived the week. A black pickup slowed beside the orchard. The driver did not wave. He looked first at the hay beneath the trees, then at the fruit still hanging above it. His name was Caleb Morrow, and unlike Jerome Parks, he had not stopped because he was curious. Caleb Morrow came back the next morning in the same black pickup, but this time he drove through the gate. He was 53, lean through the waist, with iron-gray hair cut close and boots so clean they looked wrong beside an orchard lane. His shirt was pressed even in August. 30 years earlier, his father had lost a small fruit farm after a buyer backed out during harvest and left bins of peaches softening in a shed. Caleb had spent the rest of his working life building a business around one belief: growers failed when they depended on promises they could not control. Morrow Fruit Logistics, a fictional regional packing and marketing company, moved more fruit in a week than the Mercers expected to harvest all season. Caleb parked beside the cider shed. "You've got a good crop hanging," he said. Ethan Mercer waited. Caleb opened a leather folder. "Leah's projecting 1,420 marketable bushels, correct?" Leah looked at him. "Where'd you get that?" "People talk." He offered $23 a bushel for the entire projected crop, picked to his schedule and delivered to one of his packing partners. Leah's ledger put their estimated cost at $22.54 a bushel by the time labor, spray, fuel, bins, and hauling were counted, 46 cents above cost. Ethan did the math before Leah finished writing it. The offer would move the fruit. It would remove uncertainty. It would also leave almost nothing for the repairs they had postponed all year. "That's too low," Leah said. Caleb did not argue. "It's a guaranteed outlet. We need more than an outlet. You need somebody who can take all of it." Leah closed the ledger. "Not at that number." Caleb put the folder away. His second move came 4 days later. Dennis Kroll called the farm before breakfast. "There's a question about the hay transfer," he said. Caleb had asked whether the town had legally sold or merely allowed removal of municipal property, and whether the Mercers could claim ownership of material that had never gone through a public sale. The question was technical enough that Dennis had sent it to the town attorney rather than answer from memory. Ethan felt the old panic before Leah did. "We didn't buy it," he said. "No," Leah said. "We transferred it." She opened the farm ledger and unfolded the paper Dennis had signed before the first bale left the yard. The form identified the North Hay Bay, stated that the town transferred the material as is, and placed ownership with the Mercers at removal. Leah drove a copy to the Public Works office before noon. The town attorney reviewed it that afternoon. The question ended there. Caleb did not call again about ownership. He did not need to. With 11 days left before the main harvest, Leah called the first packing house they had used in previous seasons. The manager told her there was no room on the schedule. The second said the same thing. Then the cold storage facility 26 miles away, the one that had accepted Mercer fruit twice before, said its available space had already been committed. 3 doors closed in 2 days. Leah wrote the names and times of every call. Ethan drove to the first packing house and spoke to the manager in person. The man would not say Caleb had ordered anyone to refuse Mercer fruit. He didn't have to, Earl Whitmore said when Ethan told him. Caleb's company supplied enough volume to keep those lines busy. A small orchard asking for space during harvest was competing with a customer who could fill rooms, trucks, and shifts. From Caleb's side, the logic was simple. He had offered certainty. The Mercers had refused it. He was not required to make their independence convenient. Leah stood in the packing room that evening with 1,420 projected bushels written across the top of a clean ledger page. Below it, she had written 3 names. Packing House 1, closed. Packing House 2, closed. Cold storage, closed. The payment had been made, the hay system was holding, and fruit was still hanging on the trees. But in 11 days, they would begin picking apples they had nowhere to put. Leah Mercer started with the phone book, the farm ledger, and one rule. No single buyer gets enough of this crop to close us down. Ethan looked at the projected 1,420 bushels written across the page. That means a lot of buyers. It means a lot of smaller promises. They split the crop before they had sold it. The cleanest apples went toward fresh market buyers. Smaller sound fruit was offered to bakeries and a cider press. Apples with cosmetic damage but good flesh were priced lower for processing. Leah wrote each outlet beside a maximum number of bushels, so no one cancellation could strand the whole harvest. Their first real opening came from Janet Rusk. Janet was 49, heavy-set, with copper-framed glasses and a faded burn mark on her left wrist from a commercial coffee urn. She ran a small farm market 12 miles east of Renford. 3 seasons earlier, a grower had sold her peaches described as number 1 grade, then delivered boxes with bruised fruit hidden underneath the top layer. Janet had paid for the whole load and thrown away nearly a quarter of it. She did not trust assurances. Leah brought her 2 apple samples, one marked fresh market and one marked processing, with the defects left visible. Janet turned an apple in her hand. "You're showing me the bad side. I'm showing you the side you're buying." Janet looked at Leah for a long moment. "How many bushels can you stand behind?" 80 the first week, more if the grade holds." Janet bought 40. 3 days later, she called for 40 more. The second outlet was a small cider press that could take 160 bushels over 2 weeks, but only if Ethan delivered on specific mornings before their receiving line filled. A bakery in the next township took 24 bushels at a time. 2 roadside stands agreed to smaller weekly lots. The network was inefficient. That was its strength. Instead of one truck carrying hundreds of bushels to one packing house, Ethan made short runs in the morning and came back for the next order. Leah sorted fruit by destination before it left the farm. Every buyer got the quality that had been promised, even when that meant accepting a lower price for apples that still had value but did not belong on a fresh market table. Then, Darlene Kemp came into the packing room. Darlene was 67, thin as a fence rail, with gray hair braided down the middle of her back and a left knee that stayed stiff after a fall from her porch steps. Her husband had died after a stroke 4 years earlier, leaving her a small pie stand, a chest freezer, and a business that depended on autumn weekends being good enough to carry winter bills. She needed 34 bushels. She could not pay Leah's normal processing price. "I can take 20, Darlene said. "Maybe 22 if September stays busy." Leah checked the ledger. At 22, the sale would put almost nothing above the Mercer's own cost once sorting and delivery were counted. "You need 34? Darlene nodded. "You can have 34 at 22. Darlene frowned. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Leah said. "I'm doing it anyway." Ethan loaded the bushels himself. By the 6th harvest day, the clean ledger page that had once held 3 closed doors was covered with names, quantities, delivery times, and different prices. No buyer had enough power to rescue the Mercers. No buyer had enough power to ruin them either. Janet Rusk became the first to increase an order without being asked. The cider press added another morning. The bakery wanted more small fruit than Leah had expected. Darlene sold out of apple pies on a Saturday and returned for 6 additional bushels at the same price. The system was slower than Caleb Morrow's offer. It required more sorting, more driving, and more conversations. But the apples were moving. 7,164 hay bales still held their place beneath the orchard, and in reserve, while the fruit above them left the farm in loads small enough that no one man could close every door at once. By the end of the 2nd harvest week, Leah finally had enough numbers to total what the strange summer had actually bought them. Leah Mercer did not total the summer until the last of the main harvest had left the packing room. She waited until the floor was swept. The final delivery ticket was clipped into the ledger, and Ethan Mercer had stopped asking whether one more buyer might call. Then she opened to the page where the hay count had begun. 8,000 bales had come from the town yard. 368 had been too collapsed and uneven to use in the orchard system and had gone to the compost row. That left 7,632. Then Ethan's mistake had forced them to remove the equivalent of 468 bales from the overbuilt sections. That left 7,164. Leah turned to the final distribution page. 6,824 bales were spread through the orchard in measured bands. 220 remained under cover as dry reserve for settling, wind movement, and future repair. 120 had gone to the garden, the windbreak, and small areas of exposed soil around the farm, where the same material could still do useful work. 6,824 plus 220 plus 120 equaled 7,164. The arithmetic closed. That number had held. The money did not close as neatly. The June payment of $18,600 was already behind them, but making it had emptied nearly every flexible dollar the farm possessed. Harvest income did not make Ethan and Leah rich. It gave the farm room to breathe again. Leah paid for the front tires the truck had needed since spring. She paid the balance on the packing room cooler repair. They replaced 2 failing irrigation valves instead of nursing them through another season. Ethan bought new trunk guards for the youngest trees. They set aside enough for winter pruning labor and left the rest where Leah could see it in the account, instead of immediately spending it on another improvement. Nothing about the list was glamorous. That was why it mattered. Earl Whitmore came by 3 days later. He did not ask what the harvest had earned. He asked for the ledger. Leah handed it to him at the kitchen table, and Earl read slowly through the pages that had started with truckloads and bale counts, then grown into mulch depths, irrigation times, vole signs, buyer grades, delivery schedules, and prices. He turned back to the first soil notes. "You kept all this?" "All of it." Earl tapped one page with a bent finger. "This is worth more than the hay now." Ethan smiled. "Don't tell Dennis." Earl did not smile back. He closed the book and rested both hands on it. For several seconds he looked through the kitchen window toward the sand rows. "When I sold my place," he said, "I figured most of what I knew would go with it." That was the only time Earl said it plainly. He had not been afraid of getting old. He had been afraid of becoming the last person who remembered why some of those old methods worked. Leah pulled the ledger back toward her and opened to a clean page. Earl looked at the pencil in her hand. Outside, the first leaves had started turning at the edges, and the orchard was already moving toward another season. What happened next would depend on whether anyone besides the Mercers learned how to read those pages. One spring later, the sand rows no longer look like an experiment. The hay has settled into darker, thinner bands beneath the apple trees, mixed at the surface with leaves from winter and small pieces of bark. In places, earthworms have pulled fragments down until the boundary between mulch and soil is harder to see. The clear rings around the trunks remain open. Earl Whitmore does not come every morning now. Most weeks, he comes once. When he does, he parks beside the cider shed and waits until Ethan Mercer or Leah Mercer finishes whatever check is already underway. He no longer carries the soil probe. Leah does. Earl's granddaughter, Mara Whitmore, 26, begins coming with him in April. She has the same long hands Earl once had before arthritis stiffened his fingers, and she grew up believing orchard work was something her grandfather had left behind because his body could no longer keep pace with it. She learns differently by watching him stop beside a tree and ask questions instead of giving answers. Leah shows Mara how to lift the mulch without disturbing the whole band, push the probe into the root zone, and decide whether the soil actually needs water. Mara checks the surface first. Earl taps the probe with one crooked finger. She smiles, then checks underneath. By May, Jerome Parks has spread old straw beneath 24 trees along the driest edge of his own place. Carla Benton tests a narrower organic strip in one young block. Mason Reed starts with 12 trees because 12 is the number he is willing to watch closely. None of them copies the Mercer orchard exactly. That pleases Earl more than imitation would. They measure their own soil, watch their own trunks, and change what their own ground tells them to change. Darlene Kemp returns during thinning season. She does not come for apples. She brings sandwiches, ties on an old canvas apron, and spends the afternoon beside Leah, sorting damaged fruitlets from usable ones while the first summer storm builds over the western tree line. The 34 bushels Leah sold her near cost the previous fall are never mentioned. They do not need to be. Behind the cider shed, pieces of faded baling twine still work out of the gravel after rain. Ethan picks them up when he sees them and hangs them over a nail near the door, until there are enough to throw away properly. That is the last obvious trace of the pile that once filled the municipal warehouse. 8,000 bales started the story. 368 went to compost during sorting. 468 more left the orchard system after Ethan's mistake. 7,164 found useful work and stayed there. But the number that matters most now is harder to keep in a ledger. One old grower teaches two farmers. 2 farmers keep records. 3 neighbors begin testing what they have seen. A granddaughter learns to check the soil instead of trusting the surface. None of it means the Mercers discovered a miracle. They were lucky in ways the ledger cannot measure. The rejected hay was still suitable for the uses they chose. The weather gave them time to correct Ethan's mistake. The town transfer form was clear enough to survive a challenge. Their buyers answered the phone when the larger channels closed. A different kind of contamination, a worse storm, or one missing signature could have ended the story much earlier. The work mattered, because luck did not have to carry all of it. The Mercers measured, corrected, recorded, and passed the method on. Ruined for feed wasn't ruined for soil. If you had 8,000 bales nobody wanted, what would you have tried to do with them? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have seen in that pile. And if you want more patient farm stories where the numbers, the mistakes, and the work all have to add up, subscribe and come back for the next one.